Okay. Behave, we are
Okay,
recording.
we are recording this program. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lori Lowell, the Executive Director of Home Haven, and we are happy to present bird flu, old and new risk for pandemic influenza. And this program will be brought by the Home Haven Health and Wellness Committee. And we're delighted that Pat Jackson-Allen is our presenter today. She's chair of that committee. And Pat, I'm just going to turn it right over to you and let you go ahead. And just so everyone knows, Kate is our tech person. So if you have any issues, please put your problems into the chat. And I will be monitoring the chat while Kate deals with our slideshow. And if you want to be able to see Pat clearly, please change your view to speaker. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Pat.
Hi, I'm happy to be here and happy that you guys are here on this warm beginning summer day. Bird flu, or H5N1, has been something that I have been kind of monitoring. I'm not a researcher, I'm an educator, so I would monitor the progression of this condition, this influenza, and I've been doing that for 25, almost 30 years now. And I will give you a little bit of the history on why that is a 25, 30-year history of H5N1. So it is an old and a potential new pandemic that we need to be concerned about. And certainly the news industry has picked up this concern in the last couple of weeks. Next. So let's go back to what influenza is. Influenza is a virus, a series of viruses that are divided into three types, A, B, and C. Influenza A can be found in many animals and humans, and birds are the major carrier of influenza A, and they carry it very effectively around the world. Influenza B and C, by contrast, are only found in humans and are not as common as influenza A in our annual influenza outbreaks. To remind you what your flu vaccine was this last fall, just for context, in 23-24, the influenza vaccines had two A-type viruses, H5N1 and H1N1, and one B virus, the B Victoria-like virus. So there were three types of viruses in the influenza vaccine this past fall. Next. So what do those numbers and letters mean? Subtypes of influenza A are determined by their surface protein. So hemagglutinin is the H component of that figure, and there are 16 subtypes of hemagglutinin. Neuraminidase, or N, has 9 subtypes. So when you see a virus, an influenza virus listed, and it says it's, for instance, H1N1, it means it's the hemagglutinin type 1 and the neuraminidase type 1 in that virus. And H1N1, H1N2, and H3N2 are now common human types of influenza A virus. H5N1, which we're going to be talking about later, H7N7, the list goes on, have all caused disease in humans over the years, but they are not the common influenza that we have at the moment. Bird flu is the H5N1 type of virus, and this is what we're concerned about now and what we will be talking about later today. Next. So just to make it a little more confusing, we have the H's and the N's, but we also have genetic differences in subtypes. Some types have a high pathogenic influenza A. H5 and H7 are the major types of high pathogenic influenza A. And then there are low pathogenic influenza A viruses, and most avian strains are a low pathogenic avian influenza. It's important to understand that this high pathogenicity or low pathogenicity is not how it affects humans. It is how it affects birds, because influenza A is primarily a bird influenza. So, and just to make it a little more confusing, you can have a strain circulating in birds. Let's use the one we're going to talk about now, H5N1, that can have both a high pathogenic avian influenza virus, infection, or a low pathogenic. So we've got subtypes, and then we've got this pathogenicity, and sometimes there can be both a high pathogenicity and a low pathogenicity circulating at the same time. Next. So, as we have learned with COVID, and I think you all understand as you've followed the influenza vaccines over the years, there are often changes in virus. They change for many reasons, often to continue to be alive and to be able to infect people. They make changes to adapt. Small changes we generally call drift. And we have seen this with the COVID vaccine. We've most recently, the major subtype was the Omicron, but now we have all these little types of Omicrons that have developed, and we may even have to change the COVID vaccine this fall to adapt to those new variations by drift. And the annual flu vaccine is modified for drift every year. And then a more significant change would be an antigenic shift or mutation. And if we're talking about influenza, that would be a new H and N combination, often not seen in humans before. So it would create a higher level of disease and pathology that season, because humans would not have antibodies developed for that HN combination. So we will talk in a little while about the H5N1 swine flu that came in 2009, and that was an abrupt mutation and caused a significant period of illness with influenza. But the most dramatic change would be a reassortment. In a reassortment, two viruses strains are in one host, and so they're right together, and they can exchange outer proteins and actually create a new virus. This can be done in an animal. The pig is a common vector where it collects more than one virus, and in that pig, in that host, it exchanges the influenza proteins and creates a new virus. It can also happen if you have a human virus and an animal virus side by side, and they can exchange or reassort their outer proteins and create a new virus. That new virus may have significantly different illness potential. And I think that's what we're worried about most with the H5N1. Next. So how do birds make influenza A such a problem around the world? Well, birds migrate. And often, as I indicated before, wild birds are often not as affected by the viruses as domestic birds may be. The wild birds probably just have more of an immunity built up. So you have the migratory patterns of Africa, Europe, and Asia, and that's where most of the circulation occurs. So you're most likely going to see a change in influenza virus in those regions of the world before you will see it in the Americas. But if you see that green line that goes along there, that's the line where the migratory birds, thank you, Kate, migratory birds from Africa and Europe actually do get over to the Americas. It may be 6 months later, it may be a whole year later, the migratory pattern later, but they do intersect. And so we cannot say that the Americas are safe from the avian influenzas of Asia. We're a small world and we all share our viruses. Next. So influenza A just doesn't affect humans and birds. It affects a lot of animals. Now, this is actually a fairly old slide. It's probably, 10, 15 years old. But we have been monitoring the influenza infections in animals for a long time. And one of the concerns is that as influenza gets into animals with more contact with humans, and as our environment changes, so humans have more contact with animals, there's more of a chance for humans and animals to share their viruses. Next. So this is part of what's been happening right now with influenza A. Many animals infected by specific types of influenza A in the past, but now the virus are spreading from one animal to another. And H5N1 has now been found in penguins, polar bears, and as we probably all read in March 2024, in cows in the United States. So it is a worldwide issue now affecting animals across the world. Next. So animals don't necessarily always give us infections. We can give animals infections. I don't know who took this picture. It is really cute, but we do share a high genetic commonness with pigs. And so one of the big concerns is that a pig will have viruses in its system and will share those viruses with humans, or humans will share their virus with pig, and we can get a whole new variant of influenza virus. So in 1998, H5N1 in humans was determined to have been transferred to pigs. It wasn't pigs to us, it was us to them. And in 2009, H5N1, which we call the swine flu, was pigs to humans, and it almost happened simultaneously in Mexico and California. And we'll talk about that when we talk more about pandemics in a moment. Kate? So let's talk about pandemic influenza A. Past influenza pandemics have all been of avian variety. 1918 to 1919, we had what we called the Spanish flu. We didn't know how to track the genetic development of influenza back then. This probably did not start in Spain. It probably started in the United States, but it was called the Spanish flu. And it was an H5N1 new mutant avian virus. So that meant that the human population had no prior antibody development to it. And that's why it became so lethal. From our retrospective genetic studies, we have determined that there was an almost simultaneous infection in humans and pigs. And as I said, may have actually started in Midwest United States. The Spanish flu killed 50 million people worldwide. That's a lot of people, and we had a smaller population at that time. It killed over 500 in the United States, and there was a high rate in young adults, not your usual susceptible people to influenza. And John Barry wrote a book on pandemics, which I read quite a while ago, and it killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS has killed in 24 years. That really brought it home to me, how devastating that was. And John Barry had a New York Times editorial on May 20, just last week. We need to be prepared to fight the next pandemic, not the last one, which I thought was a very important thing to be thinking about. Yes, we can learn from the last pandemic, but that may not be what we'll be facing next. Next, Kate. So you probably have seen these pictures. This is, what we were dealing with in 1918. People were dying all over. And one of the issues, well, and look at they only had cloth masks. They really didn't understand how this illness was being transmitted. Next, Kate. So here you see, these are probably all soldiers from World War I. And here they are in large rooms, no partitions, no masks, no gowns. And I do not see a sink in the entire room. So it was obvious that infection were continuing to flourish and be transmitted in these spaces where they were trying to take care of people. Next. And here's another picture from World War I. At least here we've got some cloth tents that they're trying to separate people with, at least during part of the day. But again, cloth masks, no sinks, and crowded, no social distancing. This virus would be able to spread from one person to the next. A lot of military people contracted the illness and died because they were being transported across the ocean on crowded ships where they had even less social isolation than these pictures indicate. Kate? So that was 1918, 1919. In 1957, 58, some of you may remember this, I remember it, Asian flu. It's interesting how we name these and we never name them an American flu. Asian flu was an H5N1 reassortment virus, and it killed 70,000 people in the US and started in China. We did not have influenza vaccine back then. So I can remember, I think I was about, I'll give my age away, but I think it was about 12 at this time. And I was doing my confirmation, I think. So I was going to church, and I can remember just perspiring and having a high temperature and feeling miserable, but I had to go to church. And I'm thinking, oh, that was the Asian flu back then, and that's what I had. In 1968-69, we had the Hong Kong flu. It was an H3N2, again, a reassortment. It killed 34,000 in the US, so it wasn't as serious as the 57-58, but we had more vaccines at that point. It did start in Hong Kong, and the H3N2 virus is still circulating among humans currently. It's not part of our influenza vaccine at the moment, but that's probably because most adults who were alive in 1968-69 developed some antibodies to it. So it's not causing as much illness as some of the newer varieties of virus do. Next, Kate. And then 2009, 2010, and 2010, swine flu, another triple reassortment of 2 H1 viruses in pigs. Initially, it was identified in Mexico and California almost at the exact same time, and this was in March 2009. A new H5N1 strain with little community resistance. Again, we as humans had not experienced this particular strain in decades. So what was fascinating, I was a clinician at the time. We had an influenza season that had the normal winter influenza, but then because in March 2009, this new virus was among the people, we had a spring and summer influenza. Summer camps were canceled because everybody was sick with flu. It was a very different year for influenza for those of us who were providers and those who were affected by the virus. And this gave us a better understanding of the importance of tracking zoonotic infections so that we know where they're coming from and when they're coming, hopefully, so we can prepare for them. Next. So let's get to H5N1, the one that we are concerned about now, and we're going to talk about. H5N1, high pathogenic avian influenza, a bird illness initially identified in 1996 in China. In 1997, Hong Kong had an outbreak in birds, and they killed millions of birds in an attempt to stop the spread. They had 18 people identified with H5N1, and 6 of those people died. So then the H5N1 kind of became quiet. It didn't go away, but it wasn't as prominent. And then 2003-04, the virus spread again by migratory birds, and it was this high pathogenic H5N1, and it went to many more countries in Asia. And those 2 years, there were 50 identified human cases and 36 deaths. Next. In 2005 and 6, it continued to spread, and birds in Europe and Russia were identified as having H5N1. In 2005, 96 identified human cases and 43 deaths. In 2006, 115 identified cases, 79 deaths. High infection rate in children, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And a pandemic alert was issued. As you can imagine, if you are WHO or even a CDC here in America, and you're watching a mortality rate that is approaching 50%. Now, again, these are identified people. There may have been, and probably were, lots of people with milder symptoms who were never identified as having H5N1. But still, the number of people that were identified, there was a high mortality rate. If this got going in the world, this could be absolutely horrendous. So WHO issued a pandemic alert. Just be aware, folks, we're monitoring it, and we have need for continued international surveillance. So what happened with COVID in China wasn't the first time we've been worried about the need for more international surveillance. Kate, next, please. So why did kids seem to have a higher incidence of H5N1? Well, often in Asia, kids are the ones who are responsible for the family poultry and also for the slaughtering of the poultry. So this is an indication. So they were exposed to blood where most people were not exposed to blood in Asia. And the next one, Kate. And even the adults, the open air markets, or the way that they sell their produce and their poultry, is certainly different than the way we do. We get it in a cellophane wrapper at Stop and Shop and never touch it until we cook it. But that's not the way it is in Asia. So these people will have more of a risk of having contact with sick and dying birds. Next, Kate. And Rick and I were in Thailand in 2005, and we spent the night in this village. And I asked him to take a picture because this was just a perfect setup. Already I was worried about H5N1. And I said, this is the perfect setup. You've got kids, people, pigs, chickens, all in a small area living together, hour after hour after hour, and very little access to health care. Next, Kate. So 2005, 2006, the world began to be worried about H5N1. And that included Yale University. And Yale University developed a pandemic planning committee. And I was appointed as a representative from the School of Nursing. And so this was a fascinating opportunity for me to see how the university felt that they were going to deal with a potential pandemic. So it was obviously that if this pandemic got going, it was not going to be business as usual. They were going to have to close the university as much as possible. But Yale University is responsible for 30 to 40,000 people when you talk undergrads, grads, staff, support people, the people who are part of the Yale Health Plan. That's a large community. So Yale University was not going to be able to shut down completely. And also the pandemic planning indicated that city and states would most likely be similarly affected and overwhelmed. So we needed to figure out how we were going to take care of our people. And you know, we saw this even with COVID, when the areas in the Northeast that got hit hard. Cities and states were saying, okay, you guys got to figure out what you're going to do because we're already overwhelmed. So the university said, okay, as soon as they thought this was really a potential at-home pandemic with human-to-human spread, they were going to send the faculty home. Now, I thought this was fascinating. They weren't going to send the students home first. They were going to send the faculty home first. And as they explained, the faculty is our primary resource source. We can get more students, but if we lose our faculty, and our faculty generally are older, if we lose our faculty, we can't reopen when this is over, or it would be a hard time to reopen. So they were going to send the faculty home, put them essentially in isolation in their homes. And then they would worry about the students and staff and sending them home. But as you remember, even with COVID, borders became closed. Airlines stopped flying to many countries. So chances are that Yale University would have a group of students and maybe even some staff who could not go home. And so Yale was going to have to be their home. So Yale needed to figure out how to provide essential services to those people who could not go home. So it was decided, and they started selecting which buildings would be closed first, second, third, how many buildings we needed to maintain as open or living spaces would be determined on how many people were able to get home and how many were still at Yale. But so they were going to, you know, maybe identify 2 colleges that would stay open and house students and faculty and staff if need be. But they didn't want to try to heat or maintain many buildings. They just wanted to do as few as possible. We needed to worry about food. Who was going to, one, deliver food? Who was going to prepare food? You know, if you've got a quarter or a third of the population either sick or caring for family members who are sick, you need to think of different ways of providing services. So we talked about, and I believe Yale ordered millions of military rations that were put in storage in hopes that we didn't have to use them. We didn't have to use them then, but they're still in storage, I'm sure, because they would be non-perishable. They could be pulled out, you know, 10 years later, 20 years later, and still used if need be. Heat. If a pandemic happened in the middle of winter, that was going to be a problem, because who is going to be supplying the oil or gas needed for heating buildings? Again, the reason for limiting the number of buildings that you had open. Healthcare. You know, the Yale Health Plan was going to get overwhelmed, and Yale New Haven Hospital would also get overwhelmed, like we had with COVID. Not enough ventilators, not enough masks, not enough isolation material. And again, we're talking 2005, 2006, when we didn't know as much as we know now. Transportation. Again, we may not be able to get much gas for our cars delivered. So they said, okay, we're going to take all the golf carts at the golf course and bring them to campus. And we can use those to get around campus because we will have electricity because we are able to generate electricity. And what about the morgue? As we saw with COVID, local funeral homes became overwhelmed. What would Yale do if people were dying and our people, Yale people were dying, and we could not use a morgue in the city? So the hockey rink was determined to be the best place to set up a morgue if necessary, because it could be cold and we could maintain integrity of the deceased if need be. And then one of the last concerns that was brought up was research. For many of the faculty, their life's work was ongoing in the science buildings, in the labs. We're not talking about, fill out a survey and analyze that survey results. No, we're talking about animal research, even cellular research. So we talked about how to maintain the research in the science buildings. Of course, that meant more heat, more electricity. What about personnel? We were trying to send personnel home. Would assistants, faculty assistants, be utilized to maintain these research projects? I will say that one of the proposals that was made at the pandemic planning meeting was that nursing students and faculty would be the ones who would provide health services to those who were remaining in the dormitories. I can tell you that didn't go over real big at the School of Nursing because we knew that meant that the nurses were going to be exposed more to infections than others. But fortunately, we never had to go that far. But it was a contentious issue. Next, Kate. So why were we so concerned? This is just a graph from WHO. And again, it's 10 years old now, but it shows you how the number of cases and the distribution of countries, mainly in Asia, where humans became infected and the number who died. And I found on WHO March 25 that as of then, there were 88 cases of human H5N1 that had been identified and 463 deaths. So we were running at about 50% of deaths of identified people. Next, Kate. So what is WHO saying now about bird flu? The 2020 H5N1 spread from Africa to Europe and Asia from the birds. In late 2020, it spread to the Americas. In 2023, global detection of H5N1 in non-birds, wild and domestic animals, marine mammals, goats, dairy cows. And that's particularly concerning because that's human-animal contact, where there aren't many of us who are personal with polar bears, but goats and dairy cows, we have human-animal contact. Next. And so more international research on animals is going on, where they have scientists in protective gear going out and analyzing dead mammals and birds that are found to try to determine what the spread is. Next, Kate. And the WHO is concerned about H5N1. This was an article in The Guardian. Risk of bird flu spreading to humans is enormous concern, says WHO. And again, the more that we have animals and human contact, that concern increases. Next, Kate. So what's the current status in the United States? H5N1 has been confirmed in 9,300 wild birds in 50 states. So these are birds that have died, and somebody took them or referred the health department to come out and test them. There are a lot more than 9,300 birds who have died, but these are the ones that have been tested. So in every state, we have had confirmed H5N1. 91 million poultry in 50 states have been infected and thereby killed, both in major poultry industries and in backyard poultry. We've got neighbors with, chickens, and that is harder to observe. And people need to know that if their chickens start dying, you need to contact the public health department. 46 dairy herds in 9 states are now identified with H5N1. And there have been 2 human cases, both mild, but they were confirmed H5N1. And both of these individuals had exposure to sick animals. One was in Colorado in 2022, and there's some question on whether that was a true infection. And then Texas in 2024 in March. Next. So, what is WHO saying now about pandemic concerns? Health risk of H5N1 is low for the general population as of today. Risk is low to moderate for those who work with infected animals. Data collection is spotty and symptoms may be mild. So we don't know if the spread is greater than the cases that we have identified. And the need for international cooperation and surveillance. That was certainly an issue when we had COVID, and it is an issue now. And there was a New York Times article yesterday that I found fascinating, Allies on the Guard Against Bird Flu. It was about a case of a 9-year-old boy in a village in Cambodia who contracted H5N1, but they didn't know that's what he had. They just knew he was very sick. And after being very sick for I don't know how many days, one doctor said, maybe we ought to test him. Sure enough, it was positive, but he died on the way to the hospital, to the larger hospital. And this is about how Cambodia handled that recent death. This was just in March 2024. And the difficulty in doing surveillance in rural, underdeveloped areas, and areas where if you take a family's herd of chickens, you are taking their food from them. So they're not really likely inclined to give their chickens voluntarily. They will hide them. They will try to prevent their chickens from being taken. And the epidemiologist went into the village, the family where this boy came from, and they did find that there had been a report of the rooster dying within a week or so of the boy getting sick. And the rooster was plucked and eaten because that's their food. So it's difficult in these poor countries. And we need to do more and testing for both animals and humans. Have we learned from COVID-19, or do we have pandemic fatigue? I am really concerned about that. Next, Kate. Because here we have, and we now know that we have 46 herds that have been identified, tested, and found to have H5N1. They're not killing these cows, but they are trying to isolate them. But there has been limited animal and human testing required. And there was an article in the paper, I think it was yesterday, that animals are transported from state to state, farm to farm, all the time by trucks, and there's no requirement that they be tested before they are moved. So it would be very easy for a virus to move from herd to herd. and there is no requirement for the people to be tested. Next, Kate. And there is a controversy between the Food and Drug Administration, who wants to do more testing, and the United States Department of Agriculture, who is saying economic and trust concerns have a higher priority. So farmers don't want the CDC coming into their farm and telling them that their herd is contaminated. And I can understand that. This is their livelihood, but this is impeding our ability to track infections. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I didn't put it in the slides, but with one of the herds of cattle, the researchers went and found that 50% of the barn cats had died. When the cow was infected, the barn cats would drink the cow milk that spilled, the colostrum, and 50% of the barn cats had died. So there is concern that is moving from, or that it can be lethal to other animals. Next. So just a reminder on who pandemic phases for infection. Phase 1 is no new subtypes are detected. We do know that clade 2.3.4.4b is currently the H5N1 that has been found in humans. And no new subtypes have been detected recently. Human infections with new subtypes, but no human-to-human spread. So again, we have that one case in Colorado, and we have the dairy worker in Texas, and there's no indication that they spread the infection to other family members. Stage 4, phase 4, is localized human-to-human spread, virus not well adapted to humans. And if you think back on COVID, we knew there was a little pocket here and a little pocket there. And then stage 5 is larger clusters of infections. And then stage 6 is pandemic, sustained transmission in general population. That was determined for COVID in March 2020. Alert level 6 was declared. Next, Kate. So when we talk about the farm worker in Texas having conjunctivitis, this is not a little conjunctivitis. This is a pretty dramatic conjunctivitis. This is a picture that was the New England Journal of Medicine when they were discussing this case. So what are the symptoms of H5N1? Well, incubation is generally 2 to 10 days. WHO uses 7. Initial flu-like symptoms, which means, cough, runny nose, maybe fever. Conjunctivitis has been this milder form of it. And then if it gets to be serious, it goes into the respiratory systems, and it's like what happened with COVID. It can have viral pneumonia, blood-tinged sputum, rapid progression of respiratory distress. So what I wanted to point out here is that, yes, the conjunctivitis is not like the normal pink eye that I would see in clinic. It was more dramatic, and that may be why they decided to have him tested and the test be evaluated by the Public Health Department and the CDC. Next, Kate. So in 2011, a movie was released called Contagion. And so this was 5 years after the pandemic alert of H5N1. And I think it was really based on the pandemic alert. Okay, Kate, let's see the trailer on this. Do we have sound? Well, we're not getting the sound from the video. I would, okay. It talks about a virus, an infection that is initially contracted by a woman in Asia when she's over there. It comes back, and initially there are 2 people infected, then 4, then 8, and what happens? And the CDC consulted on this film. So there is a lot that is actually quite real. If you go on to YouTube, you can type in Contagion and watch the movie, but you can also see a bunch of newsreels that were put out at the time of the movie release, talking about the reality of what was displayed there. So it talks about how this infection started in Asia, but people traveled to the United States, and also they brought in a blogger who became maybe an early proponent of we have a problem, but then became a person of false information. And so it really is a good movie, but it is not one that makes you feel real comfortable about the future. I mean, yeah, the empty airline terminals, garbage not being collected. The only thing they didn't get was the toilet paper run. They don't have that in the movie, but they have, shortages of everything else. So Kate, I think we can probably finish with that. I would encourage you, if you are interested, to review that. It is quite a good movie, actually, from an infectious disease perspective. So what do we have here in the United States? Should we be panicking? We shouldn't be panicking yet. We have had vaccine development. There is a current pandemic strain being monitored and has already developed into vaccines. But my concern is, at the moment, the virus does not go from person to person easily. If it gets to the point where we're going to need a vaccine because it's going from person to person easily, then it's a different virus. It has probably had a reassortment or a major difference. And so the vaccines that we have may not be as effective as we would like to be in the very beginning. But we have the technology now. And even though influenza vaccines have been uniformly based in egg-based technology, recombinant vaccine technology has developed, and we could probably do it that way. The warp speed vaccine program for COVID was really a game changer for vaccine development. There also is a national pre-pandemic influenza vaccine stockpile. This is a 2-antigen well match for current strains of H5N1. And there are hundreds of thousands of doses ready for that. And there are stockpiles of Tamiflu, or the antiviral medication that is being used for influenza. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday where this stockpile in some states is very adequate, could actually be distributed to hundreds of thousands of people. And then in other states and territories, it is not adequate. So again, it's not a federal program, it's more of a state program. But we do have some resources to help if this occurs. Next, Kate. How easily would a new virus spread? We don't know. We don't know how a new virus would spread. If it's aerosol in the air, like the COVID was, then it could spread quite quickly. If it's only by touch virus, it would spread quickly, but maybe not as quickly as the aerosol. 1 in 4 adults may become sick. 1 in 4 healthcare workers, police, fire, estimated 2.25 million hospitalizations. How many deaths from COVID did we have in America? I think it was over 1 million, but we didn't necessarily have 2.5 million hospitalizations. Medical burden across the nation for extended period, or it could be like COVID, where we had the hotspot in the Northeast and it kind of traveled, around the country. So we were sharing ventilators from area to area. But there was inadequate ICU facilities and respirators. and a global shortage of medical equipment and supplies, especially the masks, the 95N mask. Limited federal response, states, communities, private sectors, and individuals must play a role. So to think that the National Guard is going to come out and take care of us, probably not going to happen. So I went on to see, what our pre-planning had been prior to COVID, and I went on to the CDC, and there was a May 2006 pandemic flu.gov document. But as we found out in 2020, it didn't work so well. That may have been due to other things, but it didn't work so well. Kate, next. So in May, I went on to the CDC site just to see what they had there. And these were the documents that were listed underneath CDC and the pandemic influenza. And they were all produced before COVID-19. So they were old and out of date in my mind. And that was discouraging. Next slide, Kate. But recently, in the last week, there's been a flurry of updated information on the CDC about H5N1. And these are some of the links that I found. The one that I would refer you to, if you're interested just in more general information, is the third one, H5N1 bird flu current situation summary, May 17, 2024. It has a whole index on the left-hand side. You can look up birds, other mammals, hospitals. I mean, you can follow whatever you're interested on that side. I found that actually quite interesting, and I will continue to look at that. But actually, Yale got into the act. They had an article, H5N1 bird flu, what you need to know, May 16, 2024. So this has become a hot topic. Next, Kate. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has developed a preparedness plan for influenza and other pathogens. And this just came out in 2023. And so there's a link there. The White House has an Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. Trump has already announced that he will close that program if he is elected president. And then the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, where Dr. Fauci was employed, also is following the pandemic and developing protocols. Next, Kate. So to end with a quote from Albert Camus and the Plague, everybody knows that pestilence have a way of reoccurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in one that crashed down on our heads from blue skies. There have been as many plagues as war in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. And I think that's a great quote. Okay, Kate, you can turn the slideshow off, and I'm here for questions if anybody has any questions. Hi. I wasn't able to see you very much. So yes, I am continue to be concerned, and I will continue to follow it because it's just something that I have been interested in over the last almost 30 years. Yes.
Yeah. Go for it, John.
Okay. Yeah, what's the likelihood of this occurring? Is it sort of a regular occurrence, or does it kind of come and go in waves, and what's the near future look like?
Okay, it seems to come and go in bird waves. We had the H5N1 and then it disappeared kind of for a couple of years and then it came back. I think there is heightened concern right now because of all the other animals that have been infected. And I think it really depends on the virus, John. If it starts to change and changes so that it can spread from person to person more easily, then we could be in real trouble. And I am concerned that Asia is probably the area that it will start, and that has the least surveillance and the least testing and the most contact between animals and people. So we need to have a strong international surveillance and testing program. But even our own country, when I read in the newspaper yesterday about cows being moved from state to state with no testing beforehand, well, there goes our cattle industry,
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have things that we have to be worried about also.
Thank you.
Yeah, I am not panicked yet. I am interested. But I also do think that we need to be watching it closely. And I hope that our CDC and WHO will. I mean, they really got burned with COVID. And I hope that they have learned a lot since then. And so will be better attuned.
There's a question from Carolyn.
Oh,
And then Ginny.
Carolyn?
oh, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I recently happened to purchase some raw milk, and my children suggested to me that that might not be such a great idea in view of the material you have presented. What do you think?
The CDC is recommending that we not consume raw milk. For the time being, there has been they've tested and they have not seen a high transmission rate, but they said, I wouldn't do it now, and I won't do it, but I usually use pasteurized milk anyway. But, and the fact that cats were dying in the barns where these cows were infected doesn't make me feel comfortable. That was non-pasteurized milk that they were consuming. So, Carolyn, I would err on the side of caution. I would not.
Well, I just happened to encounter it because it was on sale at time and season. So I think it's still on sale at time and season.
Well, I think that's not a good sale point for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, they should know that that's not a good thing. Otherwise, usually in America, it's fine. But at this point, and what's happening in the cows, I would not use unpasteurized milk.
Ginny, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a couple things. One is, should we be in touch with our senator or people to encourage the agencies to do this vigilance? And the other question is, people probably know we've been pretty involved in starting Massaro Farm. They have chickens. They may be pulling in some goats or something, not sure. So I don't know what kind of things we should encourage for that local farm too, as far as, I know they had an avian thing that affected the eggs a year or so ago, and I think the whole flock switched out.
Yeah.
So I'm sure Farmer Steve is pretty aware of it, but those are sort of a two-way question. One is political and one is more local.
Well, I think it would be worthwhile to keep reminding our representatives that pandemic can happen and can happen again, that COVID was actually a relatively mild pandemic. We did not have anywhere near 50% mortality rate. So I think that's always important. I am concerned if we change administrations that will really go by the wayside. And I think Massaro Farm, any community farm program should be very aware that if their chickens start dying, they need to get tested. I don't know that there is a requirement that the flock be tested or sporadically tested, every month, every 2 months. I don't know that that exists in Connecticut. But if birds start dying, the flock should be tested, and the flock may need to be culled if one of the birds is found to have H5N1. Yeah. And this is a major thing, and as I said, in Hong Kong, where they had to cull something like 18 million birds, it just wiped out the poultry industry for a long time. But that's all they could do to try to, and yet it was the birds flying over the migration patterns that was actually causing it, but they had to kill the birds who were sick and exposed.
Barbara Judd.
Occasionally I buy small farm eggs around Bethany
Mhm.
and wondered if they are safe or they're checked at all.
You know, you'd have to talk to the farm. I don't know, and this is something that one of us can do. We can call our public health department and find out how often egg farms and poultry farms are tested in Connecticut, especially with this concern about H5N1. I don't know what the frequency of testing is. I would hope that anyone who is selling their eggs commercially would know that if their chickens start to die, they need to have them tested and be concerned about this. I mean, I don't know where I get my eggs from Costco. I guess they're big enough that they would let us know if, but you know, a lot of people, we have a farm right next to us who sells eggs, and we've often eaten their eggs. It is a little more of a concern now. I haven't heard of a big die-off of birds in Connecticut. You know, last year we did have a concern and people were encouraged not to feed birds because that brought birds together and they started to, you know, congregate, and that would be a way of sharing the virus. I have not heard that this year.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Pat, there were two messages of appreciation in the chat from people who had to leave early.
Okay.
Harriet Bergman and Ron Rosette both said, thank you so much for an excellent presentation.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed it. It was
Well-
something that I'm interested in. I will continue to monitor it and we can have
Thank you.
an update at some point. Nice to see you all.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Pat.
Pat. That was
Everyone take
wonderful.
good care. Good to
Thank
see
you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Pat, please stay on for a minute.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.